Okay, let's look at three disadvantages of experiments. The last video we looked at some advantages. Let's look at three disadvantages of experiments. The first one is artificiality. And you can see how this would be a problem because a laboratory is not a natural place. Some people, when they go to give blood or get an injection at the hospital, their blood pressure will rise, and this is so common that doctors have a word for it. They call it the white coat syndrome because laboratories make us feel weird and they are artificial. So that is one of the disadvantages of experiments. It is an unreal situation. Experiments do try to simulate the real world in laboratories. It is difficult to do that, but they try to get as close as possible. An example of one of the problems is a patient sleeping in a laboratory may act differently than when he or she sleeps at home. If you are in a sleep laboratory, which they have many places, you may find it difficult to get to sleep because you're not in your own bed. I've talked to people who say they can't sleep when they are at a hotel because it's not their own bed and it's not the same sounds that you hear outside. It's not familiar. Well, how much more if you were actually in a laboratory, maybe with something hooked to your head and electrodes and things, and we're told to relax? You might not simulate what you actually do at home. Another disadvantage is experimenter bias. The experiment may be influenced by the experimenter. And double-blind experiments are used to avoid this. Now, if somebody is being watched and an experimenter is watching them, the experimenter might have some bias as to what is going to happen. Maybe the experimenter wants a certain outcome. Maybe they just want the outcome because they want it to be positive. Maybe they want it to be negative. Maybe they realize, well, if I find a cure for this disease, it'll help a lot of people. Subconsciously, maybe they're trying to make that happen, and that's experimenter bias. It doesn't even need to be intentional. So double-blind experiments are used to avoid this. Now, a double-blind experiment is one in which maybe the doctor is giving somebody some pills, and the doctor doesn't actually know which pills are the real pills and which pills are the placebos. The person who is receiving it also doesn't know. So neither of them know. So the person who is giving the medication is doesn't know what's going on, and the person who is receiving the medication doesn't know if they are getting the placebo or not. So everybody is in the dark about this, except it's recorded and you can tell afterwards. So there's no doing things because you know what the outcome will be. Another disadvantage is limited scope, and many things just cannot be put into a laboratory. Many things cannot be researched by experiments. So some research can't be studied by experiments. Some questions cannot. For instance, research in large groups are not good for experiments. You can't get 1,000 people into a laboratory and test all of them. So there are some things that are beyond what experiments can do. Let's look at some aspects of experiments, and these are just some things you should know about. The first is randomization. It has the word random in it, so that gives you a clue. It is a powerful technique for eliminating the influence of extraneous variables. What that is doing is making things so random that when you make a selection, it will be a random selection. Another aspect of experiments, random assignment. This is a little bit different than random selection. It means that each subject has an equal chance of being assigned to a treatment group. And this is good in certain types of research where you can't necessarily be as random in selection. So you are random in assignment. Maybe there's one group that's going to receive placebos, another group that's going to receive the medicine they're hoping is going to cure a disease, and so they are randomly selected for each of those groups. Powerful technique. Now, random assignment means that the groups are relatively the same because they're randomly assigned. If you have enough, if they're big enough, those groups should be relatively the same, at least have a random representation within them. Now we're going to talk about quasi-experimental designs. We talked about random assignment of groups. Now in quasi-experimental designs, quasi-experiments, they often use that random assignment. Quasi-experimental designs are actually very accepted. It says quasi, so you would think perhaps it's a scam. It's not real. Actually, quasi just means that it's a little different than your normal experiment. I had somebody who said, a friend of mine, a good friend who's a professor at Boston University now, said one of his papers was rejected because he used a quasi-experimental design, and the person apparently didn't know what that was and said, the reviewer said, you should have used a real experimental design. Well, actually, quasi-experimental is a real experimental design. We're going to talk about it right now. It's similar to an experiment, but it does not use, and you have a picture of dice here, 2 die. That represents random assignment of groups. So there's not that randomness that we talked about with Monte Carlo or gambling techniques. Does not use random assignment of groups, and there's a reason for that, and certain researchers use that a lot. Psychological researchers use do not use quasi-experimental, and sometimes don't use random assignment of groups because of what they're actually looking for, which is interventions. Now, an example of a quasi-experiment would be a group of students in one class might be compared to a group of students in another class. Maybe I have two COM 400 classes, and I want to compare them. Well, those aren't randomly assigned. You say, well, they're kind of randomly assigned because we put our class schedule in, so it's kind of random, but actually a lot of times people will want to take one class or another. Maybe the classes aren't the same because maybe one class is at 7 in the morning. We don't have 7 in the morning classes at Bradley. When I was at Louisiana State University, we had a class at 7:30 in the morning. The weird thing was everybody was so awake in that class because I'd gotten all the early birds who wanted to be in that class, and they loved being up early in the morning, even more than I did. They were very awake. It was an interesting, great class. So, but you might want to compare those two classes, and that's an example of quasi-experimental research. It is a valid form of research, even though it skips some of the randomness that we want in other experiments. We're going to stop right there, and we'll pick up on our next video.